Today's presenting sponsor is Datadog. If your business is being driven by software, you know today's applications are more complex than ever. They're sitting on multiple layers of infrastructure and distributed services, and it can be very complicated to manage. Datadog brings visibility into every part of your infrastructure, as well as APM monitoring for your application's performance. Customizable dashboards, collaboration tools, and alerts let you develop your own workflow for observability and incident response. And Datadog integrates seamlessly with all of your apps and systems, from Amazon Web Services to Kubernetes to MySQL, so you can get visibility in minutes. You want to get started now? Go to datadog.com/cloudcast to get started with Datadog and get a free t-shirt. Datadog is trusted by thousands of enterprises. So if you haven't tried Datadog at your company or on your side project, go to datadog.com/cloudcast to try it out and get a free t-shirt. And now, on with the show.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast, coming to you live from the massive studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. It's been a little while since we've talked about things around sort of config management and automation, and we've kind of gotten ourselves wrapped up in some other stuff. And I had an opportunity last week. I ran into a good friend of the show and former person on the show. So we were out at an event, and I thought, we should chat about this. So we were going to chat while we were at the event, and one thing led to another, and bad audio quality. And so very excited to have back on the show, although remotely this time, Robyn Bergeron. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much, Brian. It's good to be back here in my part of the world, also in my massive studios.
That's right. Yeah, we were in Phoenix together last week. It was we were at an event. Gene Kim was there. It was kind of a DevOps event, and it was unbelievably hot in Phoenix. Although I think it was hot. You think it was just summer in Phoenix?
Yes. Well, you see, in my part of the country, it's more like a hairdryer. In your part of the country, this time of year, it's more like a sauna. And right. I'm more into the hairdryer hot than the sauna hot. So my glasses don't fog up when I go outside here. So
yeah, exactly. So you are now in charge of the Ansible community, or at least community director, community czar. What's new in your world? Like what's going on in the Ansible community? Because it's kind of huge and growing and growing in all sorts of interesting ways.
Yeah. So I guess my official title is something very obnoxious in the Red Hat HR system, but the title I go by in public is community architect. There's the other half of my team who is my boss, Greg de Koenigsberg. He's sometimes called himself community guy, and I don't like calling myself community gal, and he won't go for being community Batman if I'm community Robin. So I'm just community architect, and he's, Greg the community guy, and forward we go. So yeah, Ansible's, it's been growing by leaps and bounds for a couple years now, kind of unbounded, uncharted, crazy growth. So I think we're at 2,750 or so, 2,750, I guess is the appropriate way to say it in math terms or number terms. Contributors, we're around 1,000 modules, which are the things that Ansible uses to talk to other bits of technology and manage things. We've got lots of projects going on. Ansible Container is one of them, which is a interesting way to create. If you've ever written a Docker file or looked at a Docker file, you know that it's not always in the most plain of English, and we find that the language of Ansible, aka YAML, is a little bit more readable. So it's basically creating a Docker file in the Ansible language that you know and love, and using the same rules that you would to use Ansible to deploy applications in a more traditional, not containerized environment. And then it's got some fun add-ons where you can push that setup directly into a Kubernetes or OpenShift type of environment if you're that far along in your magical path to microservices, containerization, Kubernetisizing, whatever it is that we're calling it these days. So
yeah.
I did have a funny thing last night. Can I tell you my funny joke?
Yeah, absolutely. Sure.
Someone was talking about on Twitter, they said, I'm telling my computer to, please just run Kubernetes, and it's not listening. And I said, you've got to wait for Kuber Skynetes when it becomes self-aware. So I hope that someone eventually makes a machine, like an AI oriented flavor of Kubernetes, and that they call it Kuber Skynetes. So free idea for anybody out there who, would like to make probably a very funny website, if nothing else.
Yeah, well, I think Kelsey Hightower was sort of setting up Kubernetes through like Amazon Alexa. So we're getting close. He was like Alexa, run Kubernetes or something like that. So we're getting closer. But yeah, definitely someone should go run that. So you've been around a bunch of big projects. Well, you've been around a bunch of open source projects for like you ran the Fedora project. So all of its hairiness and gnarliness and lots of inputs and so forth. You've been around Elastic, which is a different kind of community. Like for anybody that doesn't live and breathe open source all the time, open source is funny these days because, depending on where you are in a project, you talk about contributors or stars or forks or whatever. Like it's always sort of numbers and people are always like, yeah, but what does that mean? Like, so you've been around enough that have been, in all sorts of different stages. Like what's healthy? What's good? Like, how do you describe like projects to people so they have some sense of like what's reality?
Metrics are a fun topic, and of course I got to lots about this when I was actually at Elastic, because a lot of what they do is around being able to count things and inputs and events and magically visualize them and store them someplace where hopefully they're not going to disappear. So learning about people keep track of metrics, and I have the tendency to feel that metrics aren't really useful unless they're, actionable. Like a lot of people counted or clicked on the star button. Like that's very neat and it's very gratifying. And I'm glad that, 20,000 some odd people have clicked the star on Ansible, because I think that's awesome. And it's a nice way to, keep track of projects that you're interested in. So it's sort of a metric, but it's like, that doesn't tell me anything about why they're clicking, or, there's no data or, anything really indicative there. Things like forks tend to be, it's at least sort of like, I hope that maybe this person is forking it in the hopes that maybe they'll contribute back. Have they contributed before? What's the likelihood? You might be able to keep track of stuff like that. Most of what I like to do is, in my eyes, community, and it's different to lots of people. Lots of people just think about it as I'm going around and talking about how to do things. In Ansible, we've always been all about empowering people to get stuff done. So metrics that I like to keep track of are things like time from the person submitted a PR until the time somebody actually looked at it and the time it was actually merged, or people interacting with it or trying to help someone out. Those are the things that are sort of indicative to me of, I guess, health, right? Because otherwise, if you're not getting to things in time, then people start getting sad and they go away, which is not healthy for a community. So things like that are things where I tend to keep my eyes peeled. But it's still, people compare, like there were a couple folks not too long ago. GitHub actually has a great tool called GitHub Archive and GitHub Timeline, which are gigantic, huge, enormous, literally big data sets stored in Google's BigQuery tool. And you can go in and literally look at every single event, including every time people comment. And in Kubernetes land, there's a lot of bot things going on where people interact with the bot. We're like, oh, we're the most active. And I'm like, talking to the bot is not necessarily interacting with other humans. And that's fine. Like, I think that's great. And that, we also have a bot. Our bot works differently, but it doesn't mean that, like, either of us is the best or the worst or anything. It's just different. So, people put numbers up like that, or when, Microsoft puts up numbers that say, like, we have more blah in GitHub than anyone else. It's like, well, yeah, but they're all under your organization. Like, you don't, okay, like, I guess if you think that's great, then, and you think it's great that they're all only on GitHub, then that's cool. But, in Fedora, like, the Fedora is not part of that world. OpenStack also not part of that world. People have mirrors on GitHub, but it's not where the action is happening. So skipping over data like that to compare, when you compare all open source projects, bear in mind they're not all on GitHub, for the love of God. Right.
Well, and I think if I'm sort of hearing all of that, it's to a certain extent you almost have to treat it like any other software, just piece of software, right? It's like, how much technical debt does it have? How fast does the debt get resolved if it makes sense to resolve it? do people actually use the software? Do they use it from one release to the next release? So, I mean, there's a lot of vanity around it, but if you really boil it down, it does ultimately kind of get back to it's software, and either it has to work and people have to use it, or it's, it could be a lot of just muck of ones and zeros.
Yeah. And people like to, I get, and we've actually talked about this recently, like, we have metrics, they're not the prettiest thing on earth, but it's all the things that we sort of care about in community land. How fast are people getting, their issues addressed, and, is that getting better for new issues, and for issues that are, older than 6 months where maybe they're still plodding along, or are those at least improving? But just having, maybe we should just have a vanity metrics page, because I see things all the time where people are like, Ansible has 1,200 contributors, and I'm like, where did you get that? Like, or there's another one that I saw on actually a Red Hat deck somewhere that said, like, Ansible's 11th most popular open source project. And I said,
okay.
According to what? Like, I mean, popularity is measured in 1,000 ways and is, subjective. Right. And it's kind of like high school. Like, I'm very popular in the band crowd, but, maybe not with the chess crowd. Who knows? So.
Yeah. Well, so
it's mostly people are happy, and that makes me happy, and that's probably, if I'm not happy, that's my own personal measure. So
yeah. So, like I said, you and I were at this DevOps event. Gene Kim was kind of keynoting, and we were talking about different stuff. So, in the DevOps world, it kind of took off as a bunch of config management tools. So obviously Ansible plays a role in there, but we've seen other stuff. But I always get this sense with DevOps, and I'm curious on your take on it, is like DevOps has kind of started as like, hey, use automation, and then it became like, well, but we got to get these teams to work together, so focus more on, making people like each other and play nice together, and empathy and all this stuff. Like, Ansible kind of plays a role where, like, you can just be helping network admins and automating stuff. You could be helping sysadmins and Linux admins. And I mean, like, do you guys have a take on, I mean, do you kind of go out into the market and go like, hey, we help people with DevOps? Or do you sort of look at yourself and say, look, Ansible's great at just automating software getting deployed. The world's becoming more software. Just make automation a core part of what you do. Like, what's the intersection? If I had one of those, charts, I forget what they call them, where it's a bunch of circles that overlap each other. Like, where does Ansible and DevOps? Where's the Venn diagram of like Ansible and DevOps, considering that you guys kind of play in lots of different, domains of deploying software? So,
I guess there's a couple things, and I part of what is Ansible's point of view, and there's certainly the Ansible point of view of, we, like most companies, have advertising and capabilities and stuff to many, many different markets. I think, internally, if we're actually engaging with, the community, or, if sales folks are talking to a customer, depending on where they are in their magical DevOps journey, it sort of depends. But I think, by and large, the thing that we've seen and that we've heard more than anything else, and actually it was interesting because I heard this when I was actually at Elastic too, was that it was the first tool that anybody had ever, sort of discovered, where they found that people in the other side of the house were also using it, right? Like, so they found, just for the dev and ops, like the very traditional, the dev folks and the ops folks, it was like, hey, we're in ops and we're using this thing, and developers were using it too. And it was the first time that they ever said, like, oh my God, we actually agree on something. Okay, this is weird. Like, let's hold on a second. Like, we're sure we're all doing the same thing. Yep, we're all using the same tool. Like, very odd. It's in DevOps, we've always said, it's not about tools, it's more about culture. But, sometimes culture is hard. In fact, people are way worse than computers, when you get down to it. And, anything that can bring two groups together, like, it's not about tools, but, if it just happens to be the inspiration for that cultural shift to start happening, then hooray. And the nice part is that it tends to be, Ansible tends to be has a low barrier to entry for getting started. So
yeah,
it tends to be something that has more of a grassroots internal, rather than the top down, just like DevOps tends to fail when someone comes in and says, we're all going to start DevOpsing. When people have more of a grassroots type effort, or start sharing with each other and, trying things out and experimenting, things tend to go better that way. So we found that it helps and it enables people a lot, on their path. So, and a lot of it is just, talking to people who saved 15 minutes one week, finally got all those crappy shell scripts out of their, VI, your diary file or whatever. Like they peeled all those out and started, automating those things. And, even if it's just their personal stuff that they have to do every week, like I have to go and set up 20 accounts for the new hired folks on these 30 machines. Like I did this when I was at Motorola. Like it sucked. And then when I discovered Expect, this was the 90s, it was awesome. And, I saved a bunch of time, and people save time. And that's, when you start chipping away at your technical debt, is I finally am not underwater this week. I'm at the water line, which means I can, start getting ahead. And when people tell me like, I actually saw my kids this weekend, or this was the first weekend ever that I was on call and nobody called me, is like, wow, like your life is actually better. It's not like, yay, I helped you do a thing, but like, when people's lives are better, that's like when your work is really gratifying. So
yeah, no, that's good, and it makes me feel good, because I sometimes I wonder, I tell folks a lot of times when they kind of go, well, like, where do we get started on a DevOps journey, and what do we do, and you don't, like you said, you don't really want to just go like, well, here's a tool and throw it at you, but there is a certain amount of being like, if multiple people in your organization can agree to use a tool, or they just sort of serendipitously are sort of using common stuff, like it'll force you to have sort of common language. It may force you to begin to start to use common process and procedure, which, fundamentally is sort of what a lot of this DevOps stuff begins to look like when you get it right. It's like we use common tools, we sort of agreed with each other about how to do certain things, and so it makes me feel good that I'm not sort of completely out of my mind when I'm sort of saying that. You're seeing it both from the devs and the ops.
Yeah, well, and I think there's also an element certainly of, are people even aware of it and talking about it to each other, like other than surprise, someone comes in one day. I mean, when we were at the event, someone just said, like, I'm getting this book for all the people I know. And that's, when that book came out, I decided that I would send it to, or actually I didn't send it. I mailed Jim Whitehurst and insisted that he read it. I mean, this was like, I don't know, 5 years ago. And 3 months later, he was like, sorry, it took me so long, but you were right. Oh my God. Like, this book is amazing. And when I told Gene, he about fell down. Like, we were standing in a hallway somewhere, and he was like, oh my God, because Jim was the COO at Delta, and like that book is all about bottlenecks, and if there's a bottleneck out there, it's people and metal tubes and their luggage. Like that's a good way to think about how bottlenecks can actually be. So
yeah, I mean, you're talking about Gene's book, The Phoenix Project, I'm assuming.
Yes, that book, not the new one, which I have a copy of, and I have flipped through it, and I promised him I would actually look, and he was not wounded. So.
Yeah. So speaking of sort of commonality of technology, so let's kind of, I want to bounce containers off you a little bit. A few years ago when containers first came out, there was this sort of, I don't know, it's the typical sort of mindset of like anytime anything new comes out, it must automatically in the tech industry kill off something else, because otherwise it doesn't have space in the big ecosystem of tech. And one of the first things that people talked about with containers is they said, well, if I can just describe everything in a container, put it in a Docker file, I no longer need config management tools, and I no longer need, and there was this like, whoa, okay, well, wait a second, maybe that's the case, maybe that's not the case. Like, give me a sense of obviously that hasn't happened because the world's not 100% containers, and Ansible and lots of other tools are doing well. Like, where does Ansible fit in the big container world as, developers can start describing stuff as Docker files, but yet there's still lots of other things that have to get automated? Like, where's that all kind of juxtaposition these days?
So, one of the reasons that we actually started Ansible Container was just to pull together the gazillions of best practices that we have seen people doing with, originally with just Docker and then, LXC, LXD, and then, as Kubernetes people starting seeing people do combinations of all these things and just sort of looking at, what's worked for people, what's not worked for people, and trying to pull lots of that together. The interesting thing is, there's plenty of people out there who still do, outside of Ansible containers, still do have all their own homegrown, the way that they do things that fits in with, their work environment. And it's great because Ansible is super flexible. I mean, almost to the point where, you can do really amazing things with it. And you can also, accidentally, build yourself a terrible pile of crap that in 2 years you'll be like, why did I do it that way? But, it's a learning curve, whatever. Fortunately, you can build it in chunks and lots of it's reusable, and you can get rid of the parts that you don't necessarily want to reuse and keep the rest. Anyhow, but, now there's, it's not just containers, but there's all these different frameworks, orchestration. Ansible has actually always been a orchestration tool that just happens to do config management. So watching the world of, what's the most popular orchestration tool? And I'm like, well, we sort of fit in there too, but, I guess orchestration is, reserved as a word these days for things like Kubernetes and Mesos and stuff. So anyway, turns out most of those tools also, occasionally need to be managed. And that's where Ansible is really, we've got Kubernetes modules, we've got, sometimes you have to install those things, right? You have to actually install places for those things to live unless you're, just consuming out of a cloud provider.
Right.
We've seen, as far as OpenStack goes, we've gone from, being a scrappy little tool that some folks use to being the most used tool in that ecosystem. And now as all of OpenStack has been moving to containerized stuff and now containerized stuff, running in Kubernetes, there's still plenty of folks who want to use Ansible in that process because it tends to be a little easier for the operators who have to manage that stuff day to day, not the applications, but like the whole shebang, like, is it up and running?
Right.
And that's, a place where we come in. And if people want to use it to, define their applications, as we're seeing people do, I think that's great too. It just depends on, I always joke that, you don't have legacy stuff until you're more than 1 day old as a company. But, people do, a lot of people, especially if they're building stuff out on their own in a private cloud type of way, have lots of stuff that all needs managing, and you find that having 27 sources of truth is a little bit more difficult to manage than, one.
Right.
So
kind of expanding on that. So you mentioned Kubernetes as a thing that people are using to, orchestrate containers and so forth. And we see this all the time with engineers. It's like, well, there's something that exists. It does 89% of what I want. So instead of expanding the other 11%, I will just build my own tool, right? And we've seen this over and over again historically. But like Kubernetes seems to now...
This is how we stay in business.
That's right. So, but Kubernetes now seems to have this new fascination that everybody and their brother wants to build a Kubernetes deployment tool. I build a tool for deploying on AWS and a deployment tool for this. Like, why does that happen? I mean, is it just purely the engineering, kind of fantasy of like, I'm going to build something that's so much better? Or like, why does that keep happening? Why don't people just go, there's already this Ansible Kubernetes thing, I could just expand upon it or modify it or whatever? Like, what drives that mentality?
Well, I mean, some of it is, I think some projects don't want to look like they've pledged an alliance to a specific tool. Like, Kubernetes as a project, I don't believe endorses any specific method of doing it. There's usually like a quick start where everybody just says, yeah, this is probably the easiest way that you might want to play with this. ... Please don't, keep this up and running in production for the rest of your life because you're going to be very sad.
Right.
But after that, a lot of the, just seeing how it's played out in OpenStack, the OpenStack Ansible folks, which is the mostly Rackspace developers, and that's what runs, one of the Rackspace clouds or whichever ones they've got still running these days. And I love those guys to death, but it's we deploy Ansible in containers, and I think they're LXC or LXD containers, and then we SSH into those containers and we make them look the way we want to, which, is not a appealing looking thing to other people who are like, ooh, you're not supposed to actually do that with containers. But, it's the thing that works for them.
Right.
So there are other Ansible and container projects which, aren't necessarily tied to, we have to move very slowly. If there's a vendor and it's their project and they've open sourced it, but it's also the thing that runs their own infrastructure, they're not really wanting to, make radical changes because they're still depending on it. So, if there's a clear, jumping line from, this way and it will take a while, or I can start something new, people will sometimes start something new. Sometimes the older people will eventually migrate to it, but they aren't necessarily always in the best place for radical experimentation when, they have customers and stuff. So
Right. Yeah, and I think the other thing that's sort of been on my checklist of the Ansible is everywhere thing is there's this thing called the Open Service Broker API, which was this project between taking the Cloud Foundry Service Broker and moving it to Kubernetes. The Kubernetes folks are now working on that, and then there's a bunch of people that are making kind of the big thing with Service Broker API is like I talk to an API, it goes to some third-party service, so people would have it talk to like an AWS service or an Amazon service or an Azure service or something like that. But now the folks are making it extensible to basically like every Ansible playbook. So it's like, oh, you want just a database as a service and spin up an Oracle database? Cool, just call this Ansible playbook or whatever. So it's cool to see, like you said, like 1,000 or so modules are now going to be kind of readily available off the back of this kind of common service broker.
Yeah, and that's the Ansible Service Broker stuff is actually, it's similar in some ways to Ansible Container, and there are elements about it where I'm like, oh, I wish we would have done some of that. I mean, a lot of it was mostly, we have this thing called Ansible Galaxy where I don't even know these days, like 8 or 10,000, roles are out there so that you can, and I always joke that like 300 of them are Nginx, but, if you would like to install just about anything and then also maybe have tools to manipulate that stack of whatever it is that you've spun up, people have shared their, very generic, for multiple operating systems roles that are all out there. And that's, was sort of the goal of Ansible Container was that any of these roles that you would normally use to whatever go into your VMs or your traditional hardware, you can now put it into containers and then into Kubernetes land. And so in some ways, Ansible, the Ansible Service Broker stuff is a little similar, but also slightly different in that it's not necessarily starting from the I want to make a Docker file out of roles perspective. It's a little different, and it's not in the Ansible group. It's in a different group. So trying to keep up with it because it's also just like Ansible Container. Like I look at it here and there, but like I'm not quite, it's not to 1.0 yet. So right. I'm not, every time I would sit down and learn something about it, I'm like, oh, I just found out that this is now old as of, 10 minutes after I got done. So
right, does 10 new things, and you got to keep up with them. But that's cool though. But like you said, it's basically this way of thinking about, how do I reuse what I put a big investment in already, and I've already learned, but yet it's going to be, hopefully somewhat modernized to, work with a container, work with an API, kind of move you into that containerized world, but you don't have to throw everything else away, which, for a lot of companies, if you're not looking to just build a brand new tool by yourself, like that's valuable because I don't have to rebuild it. I don't have to relearn it. I don't have to, reprocess everything.
Yeah. And that's the thing is like the cost of learning anything new,
yeah,
is sometimes high. I mean, in the case of Ansible, it's not, huge. I mean, maybe over time as other people in your org, like the cost of figuring out that maybe instead of us having playbooks all over the place, we should centralize them somehow is, a point that people get to. And then they're like, okay, we got to pause all the activity this week and like just work on consolidating this stuff so we're not redoing each other's work. But, some tools, it's like, I'd like to learn this thing. Great. Go to training for 3 weeks and then come back. And most people are like on fire. They can't do that. So anytime you can reuse stuff and it, keeps it in the same language or the same methodologies that you're used to using is huge for people.
Yeah. Let me wrap up with one last thing. And if this goes on a rant or if it goes nowhere, that's fine. This kind of concept of serverless, right, which is, a lot of people talk about, around things like AWS Lambda, but there's multiple other ways of doing this. Like, does the Ansible community have an opinion on serverless? Because sometimes it gets talked about as, well, there's no more ops. We don't need an ops anymore. Don't worry about it. Ansible tends to be a tool that, has a big community around operations. Like, does anybody care at this point? Is it intersecting with you guys at all? Or is it it's out there?
There are people in the community who have cared enough to build a bunch of Lambda modules so that you can do your stuff for Lambda with AWS. We actually talked about this at the Contributor Summit a little bit, mostly because we were talking about there's a tool out there called Zool, which is actually the tool that OpenStack folks use to do CI, and they have basically ripped out Jenkins and replaced it with Ansible, and they use that to the tune of a lot of contributors and several thousand jobs per hour. Anyway, in talking about how node allocation and inventory usage is actually allocated, someone was suggesting that will kind of suck if I'm very far away from XYZ machine. Wouldn't it be cool if we could do some serverless stuff? And I'm looking at these guys. I mean, these are lots of Ansible folks and the OpenStack infrastructure team, and they're like, dude, are you basically talking about serverless? And we want to light that word on fire because it's so offensive, because we all understand that serverless still needs servers.
Yeah.
And, he explained, some of the ideas, and I think just when he started using the word Lambda instead of serverless, people's souls were a little happier. I mean, it's out there. It's like anything. I mean, there's people like Ansible, and they want to tie it to the stuff that they're doing, and this is why we have 1,000 modules for everything on Earth, including things that you haven't heard of. Like, my favorite example is someone submitted a module for a piece of software called Honey Badger, and it took us a while to find someone who could agree that yes, this was the best way to do a module for the Honey Badger software. But we were like, no, but what on earth is this? But that's the thing our philosophy has always been that we, just the people employed to work on Ansible can't possibly ever have the breadth or the depth of knowledge in all these emerging spaces, which is why we, share the power with everybody else, because those are the people who are using those other tools that we'll never actually touch. They'll always be the experts in those areas. So.
Yeah. Well, that's cool. So there is sort of the inklings of how to make some of these tools like Ansible play with some of the stuff that's serverless or whatever, Lambda-ish, function-ish, and that's cool.
Yeah, well, and actually, when I went and looked at it, I was like, oh, I actually, because I understand Ansible and I can look at this stuff, I actually understood it quite a bit better, because it was rather than me going and learning all about serverless, it sort of gave me the short version in the Ansible language of, what was going on. I was like, oh, now I get it. Sweet. It's not just this crazy thing where they're flushing all the servers down the toilet. It's cool.
Yeah. Well, cool. Well, listen, I'm going to wrap it up there. What's the best place if somebody wants to, reach out to you and talk Ansible, come to one of the events, figure out when the next Ansible Fest is? What's the best way to go track down the Ansible community?
Oh, well, other than the next Ansible Fest is on September 7th in San Francisco. You can usually find me on Twitter almost always. I mean, my account continues to be there, but I check it frequently. It's at Robyn Bergeron, ROBYNBERGERON. Ansible community, I mean, we're on IRC. You can follow Ansible on Twitter. I'm not a hard person to find on the internet. I still have people sending me mails requesting me to call them personally about helping them upgrade their Fedora and boxes, which have been EOL'd for about 16 releases now. So
yeah, once a community, always a community.
Someone who wants to talk Ansible can find me. So.
Right, very cool. Well, listen, Robyn, thank you very much. Hope you don't melt out there, and great to talk to you. And folks, for Aaron and for Robyn, we're going to wrap it up for this week, and we will talk to you again soon.
Thank you for listening to the Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.